Our speaker today is going to be Dr. Vic Anderson, and he's the Director of PhD Studies and Professor of Pastoral Ministries. Dr. Vic Anderson has been part of the DTS family since 2006, and he's connected with both departments, and his passion is helping people learn the Scriptures. And whether that's in a classroom, through the local church, or literally even in a mud hut. Outside of DTS, Vic actively engages in preaching and teaching ministries through his local church, with perspectives courses, and just about anywhere people want to hear the Word of God. He and his wife Cindy are presently preparing for their 16th trip of summer ministry in Ethiopia. And I want to go on and tell you an amazing opportunity. If you want to go travel with a professor overseas and to get real-world experience teaching, an amazing opportunity. And so I'd love to encourage you to talk with Dr. Anderson about that opportunity that would be available for any of you.
Since it is our centennial year here at Dallas Seminary, it has been good to have several chapels that have helped us celebrate our identity as Dallas Seminary. And it's been great. We've led chapels that have helped us recall with gratitude our history, chapels to build our anticipation for the future as Dallas Seminary. We've had chapels that have helped us recall the vision of our founders. And we are delighted to be known as Dallas Seminary. But this morning, I'm going to shift our focus just a bit from our identity as Dallas Seminary to our identity as the people of God. Because we are the people of God. People called out from the world, chosen by the Father, redeemed by the Son, being transformed by the Spirit, and journeying together to that great day when the reign of Christ fills the earth. It's good to be the people of God. I do not like death. I'm not talking about the kind of death that's mediated by the plastic pixels on your television screen or at the movie theater. That kind of death where people get shot at and stabbed and blown to pieces, and the actors are very much alive, and they collect very real paychecks after they die. I'm talking about real death. I don't like hearing about the death that comes from war in places like Ukraine and Israel, where people's lives are being snatched away. I don't like hearing about death that comes quickly from fentanyl or slowly from cancer that eats away at people. I don't like hearing about death that occurs when people plunge from a bridge in Baltimore and their life is suddenly gone. I especially don't like death when it's taken hold of someone I love. I remember all too well the passing of my father a few years ago as lung disease, like a boa constrictor, took the last breaths from his lungs. I don't like death. And you don't like death. We find it repulsive. And the more violent the death, the more brutal the death, the more unwarranted the death, the more repulsive we find it. And therefore it seems so odd that in Christianity, where our faith revolves around the death of the central figure. So odd. Indeed, people from the outside would look at this celebration of death that we engage in so regularly and think us quite weird. It's incomprehensible. I mean, think of it. The most prominent symbol of Christianity is the cross. You go to church and every week probably sing at least one or two songs that speak of death of Jesus. Almost every book in the New Testament speaks of his death. We celebrate the Lord's Supper to remember his death. And on this week, Passion Week, what do? We climax it in a Good Friday where we somberly remember his death. What is it we see in the crucifixion of Jesus that makes us keep repeating this memory of his death? What do we perceive in this brutal death that keeps us coming back and reviewing it and bringing it up? We want to answer that question this morning, and we're going to do so by looking carefully at some of the details of the crucifixion from one of the gospel writers. And what we're going to find is that indeed the death of Jesus is both tragic and marvelous. It is awful and awesome. It is repulsive and somehow at the same time attractive. So I want to invite you to listen to the words of one of the gospel writers. And just for a few moments, may I ask you to keep your Bibles closed and your phones off and just listen and imagine that scene when Jesus was taken to the cross. You'll remember that Jesus had been in this Garden of Gethsemane, and he had been arrested and taken off by the Jewish authorities and put into a false kind of mockery of a trial and then thrown into a cell. And he waited for the morning light of Friday to break through the day for the next event, which indeed was most tragic. Hear the word of the Lord. Early in the morning, the chief priests with the elders and the teachers of the law and the whole Sanhedrin reached a decision. They bound Jesus and led him away and handed him over to Pilate. "Are you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate. "You say so," Jesus replied. The chief priests accused him repeatedly. So again, Pilate asked him, "Aren't you going to answer? See how much they are accusing you of?" But Jesus still made no reply. And Pilate was amazed. Now, it was the custom at the time of the feast to release a prisoner whom the people requested. A man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder during the uprising. The crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. "Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate, knowing it was out of envy that the chief priests had handed Jesus over to him. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead. "What shall I do then with the one you call king of the Jews?" Pilate asked them. "Crucify him!" they shouted. "Why? What crime has he committed?" But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him!" Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. What do we see in this crucifixion of Jesus? we see tragedy. And the tragedy unfolds with three different kinds of developments. And the first one that seems almost so pronounced is the tragedy of the king being rejected. Rejected by the authorities, rejected by the crowds, rejected by Pilate himself. Three rejections by these Jewish authorities that makes this event drip with a sense of tragedy. If you have your Bibles, let me invite you to turn to Mark chapter 14 and notice with me some of these most important details where Mark emphasizes the king is rejected. We're Mark chapter 15 and verse 1, where we find that early on that Friday morning, the chief priests, the elders, the teachers of the law, the whole Sanhedrin gathers together to come up with a plan. This is not a brand new plan. They've actually been conniving for quite some time. But now it all begins to take shape because what they want to do is get rid of Jesus. And they put their heads together and they figure out, we can't kill him ourselves. Rome won't let us do that, but we'll accuse him of insurrection. I mean, he said he was a king. He must be wanting to overthrow Rome. And so they come up with this plot. These, of course, are the people who should most quickly recognize Jesus as the king. They have no desire to gain justice. They have only a desire to reject and remove Jesus. So they take him to Pilate. And of course, Pilate, he's a political animal. He's a man who's going to use every situation he can for his own opportunity. So why not leverage this? So before Pilate makes a decision, he caters to the crowd. He does some things to make sure he could win some brownie points with these Jewish people. And so he turns over this opportunity to the crowd, and the Jewish authorities stir them up, of course, so that the crowd will respond with rejection. And it's an amazing thing that the Jewish people would say, crucify him. Crucify him. You must understand that normally when the Jews would engage in capital punishment, it would be by stoning. Or perhaps by beheading, but not crucifixion. Even the Romans considered crucifixion so dreadful, so tragic, so brutal, that they would only do it for the worst of criminals. And here's the people of Israel, Jesus' people, saying, crucify him. The tragedy of rejection moved from the elders and the chief priests and the Sanhedrin now to the crowd, and then finally, of course, to this representative of Rome himself, Pilate, where he is going to say, I don't see anything wrong, but go ahead, you can have Barabbas, and he sentences Jesus to be crucified. In fact, Pilate comes across as this spineless people pleaser who will do all he can just to get this out of his hands. Rejection. Rejection of the king, and it is tragic indeed. But this rejection builds all the more, or the tragedy builds all the more in two more kinds of rejection, as Mark continues. The soldiers led Jesus away into the palace, that is the praetorium, and called together the whole company of soldiers. They put a purple robe on him and twisted the thorns to make a crown and set it on him. And they began to call to him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Again and again they struck him on the head with a staff, and they spit upon him, falling on their knees, they paid homage to him. And when they'd mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put his own clothes back on him, and then they led him out to crucify him. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, he was passing by on his way from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means place of the skull. And then they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him. Dividing up his clothes, they cast lots to see what each would get. It was the third hour when they crucified him, and the written notice of the charge, it read, "King of the Jews." They crucified two robbers with him, one on his left and the other on his right. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "So, you who are going to destroy the temple in 3 days, come down and save yourself." In the same way, the chief priests and the teachers of the law mocked him among themselves. He saved others. He can't save himself. Let this Christ, this King of Israel, come down now from the cross so that we may see and believe. Those crucified with him also heaped insults on him. At the 6th hour, darkness came over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of those standing near him heard this, they said, "Hey, listen, he's calling for Elijah." One man filled a sponge with wine vinegar and put it on a stick and offered it to Jesus to drink. Now, leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down, he said. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. Tragedy number 2. Jesus, the King, was ridiculed. Ridiculed as king by soldiers and by a mode of execution and by all who would gather there. Notice what the soldiers have done. They have put him in a purple robe to mock him as a king. They beat him with a staff. They knelt with him in scoffing. They would even say, as the Romans would say, "Hail Caesar!" They would mockingly say, "Hail, King of the Jews!" The king tragically ridiculed by Roman soldiers. But Mark explains even further that when the Roman soldiers get done with this scene where they're like playing like a cat with a mouse, and they finally get tired perhaps of mocking Jesus and playing this game, and they walk him out and they bring him to crucifixion, and it would be so obvious that this mode of crucifixion, this mode of execution is intended to bring humiliation and ridicule. For Jesus had already been stripped of his clothes with a purple robe and then stripped again, and then he was flogged, and now he would hang publicly exposed for people to look in awe. You think of how a firing squad is, or death by lethal injection, or an execution that is from an electric chair. They're relatively private and quick, but crucifixion, it's public and slow to ridicule the executed. Jesus is ridiculed by the Roman soldiers. He's ridiculed by the mode of crucifixion, and he's mocked by the Jewish leaders themselves, where in verses 31 and 32 they will say, he saved others. He cannot save himself. It's tragic. Jesus was ridiculed as king. What do we see in the crucifixion of Jesus? We see tragedy, the tragedy of rejection, the tragedy of ridicule, and perhaps most climactically, it's the tragedy of non-deliverance, the tragedy of non-rescue. Jesus will not be rescued by his Father. There are several indications of this that Mark is bringing out with the way he describes the scene. He describes darkness coming over the land in verse 33. And you know that darkness is so often associated in the Bible with death. God sends in the middle of the day, not the light of life, but the darkness that would communicate death. For those who would know of the Exodus account, they would know that the 9th plague, the plagues increase in intensity as you go through from plague 1 to plague 2, plague 3, up to plague 9, the plague of darkness, because the next plague, the 10th, will be a plague of death. And perhaps prompted by this darkness that comes in the middle of the day, Jesus cries out in his quotation from Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? It is not that God will do nothing for Jesus, it's that Jesus is recognizing at this point in a great lament that God is not going to deliver him. He will suffer to the end. There's darkness, there's lament. And then there is this attempt to say, perhaps Elijah will come and deliver him, because there were certain Jews of the day that believed that Elijah might even still be living. And so when Jesus cries out, my God, Eloi, but maybe Elijah will come. But he doesn't. Nothing happens until Jesus breathes his last. And he dies. It's the tragedy of non-rescue. Tragedy of tragedies. The creator of life has lost his life. The one who rescued others like Lazarus from death will not himself be rescued from death. What do we see in the crucifixion? Tragedy. The tragedy of the king rejected. The tragedy of the king ridiculed. The tragedy of the king unrescued. I suppose if that was all there was, we'd close our eyes and shake our heads and never want to return to this story. But instead, woven into this story of tragedy is something of great marvel, something that pulls us forward. And Mark is careful to craft this marveling element all the way through his story, and he gives to us the vindication of Jesus as king. In 2 short verses, everything changes. Because Mark says, no. This is God's king. Look with me at chapter 15 and verse 38 and 39. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, "Surely this man is the Son of God." Something marvelous. The vindication of Jesus as king. There are two indications here. Let's take the second one first. We'll do it in reverse order. We start with the centurion who makes this incredible statement, this climactic emphasis for Mark, because Mark has been building the idea of what do you see in this Jesus. He has talked already about the Jewish authorities who say, let's see. If he comes down, we will see and believe. He's spoken of those who would want Elijah to come. And the text says, look, we will wait and see what happens when Elijah comes. And then finally what we see is through the eyes of a centurion who sees something marvelous. What did the centurion see? The text says he saw how he died. You understand, the centurion is not, he didn't hear a voice from heaven, right? He's not a person who's read the Old Testament prophecies. It doesn't seem like he's a person who's gotten a sermon preached to him. Instead, he watches Jesus die, and it concludes, this one is the Son of God. How does he see that? He's probably seen scores of deaths. But Jesus is different. He sees Jesus give up his life with faith in the Father. He sees Jesus in self-denial rather than self-defense. He sees this one die not with self-preservation, but with self-sacrifice. He says, surely this is the Son of God. You see, when Jesus was questioned by Pilate, Jesus didn't defend himself, and even Pilate was amazed. When Jesus was exchanged for Barabbas, he didn't call for an attorney to be rescued of the injustice of this switch. When Jesus was flogged, the text says he received the lashings from the whip. When he was mocked by soldiers, he did not stand and defend himself. And though he could have had pain relief from wine offered to him, he refused. Jesus engages in this self-denial that proves to the centurion, this is the Son of God. You see, my friends, there was a point to all the suffering. And the point is this: he is the true king. But it wasn't just the centurion who is making this indication for those who would see. I take it God himself has done the same thing, because what does the text say? The temple curtain was torn in two. A curtain perhaps 75 feet high. It was torn from top to bottom, and Mark makes no other comment about why that would happen, but I think the context here is God saying to those who would crucify Jesus, you're wrong about him. This is an act of judgment. The temple system is done. Your access through the temple is gone, because this is my king and my Son. Here is the vindication of Jesus as king. Tragedy and marvel. That's the cross. How do you respond to all that? I think you're doing it right now. Because we marvel at him. We marvel, and then we are pulled to follow him. I believe this is what Mark is driving at, that we would be startled that his self-denial is so different from us. So different than what we see in people like us. We defend ourselves, right? When we're threatened, we seek to exercise our rights and to speak up and to get an advocate. We preserve ourselves. We put double locks on our door. We put our security systems in place. We make sure we have video cameras to protect us. And we buy our insurance, and we say to one another, see you later. Stay safe. We constantly think about how to save ourselves. And Jesus is completely different. We marvel at him. And as we marvel, we follow him. We follow him. And that following must mean that we should expect to follow him even in suffering. For if our King can sacrifice like this, then his expectation is, as he stated, for his followers to do the same. Indeed, Mark has gone to great lengths in this gospel to demonstrate that disciples need to follow. He said to them, pick up your cross, follow me. But at the crucifixion, they fail. They fled. Mark writes in a way that we will all learn from the mistakes of the disciples. Instead of fleeing the suffering, we'll follow him toward it. How do you respond to the crucifixion? Realize it's tragic, but marvel at him and follow all the way to the end. The great hymn writer Isaac Watts helped us recognize that we don't have to be lovers of death. But he penned words that helped us marvel at Jesus' death. I've asked the musicians to return so that we might respond with a prayerful response of singing. When I survey the wondrous cross on which the Lord of glory died, my richest gain I count but loss. Pour contempt on all my pride.